Hello, everyone. We can get started now. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you. My name is Anherad Lang. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. Delighted to be starting us off today with this fourth session of the learning stream on the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, jointly organized by ICVA and PHAP. It's great to see so many people now on the line, both familiar faces and newcomers. I noticed that we have a particularly diverse group. Today we had registrants from 95 different countries. So thank you so much, all of you, for being here, for introducing yourselves in the chat, and we look forward to a productive and interesting discussion today. I'd like to introduce my co-host, Melissa Patotti from ICVA. Over to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Anharad. It's great to be back with you today. My name is Melissa. I'm with the ICVA NGO Network. It's a network of NGOs dedicated to principled and effective humanitarian action. We wanted to take this opportunity to thank the donors who provide core support to ICVA to help make this possible. That includes Danita, Germany, IKEA, Swedish SIDA, Switzerland, and of course the ICVA members who pay their membership fees to make these learning sessions a reality. All right, so I'd like to just give a little bit of framing for today's session and why we want to hone in this learning stream on the humanitarian development peace nexus. Why do we want to hone in on the perspective of peace-building actors? For those of you who joined previous webinars on things like the new way of working, we described how the new UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, when he took his office, he said that we really need to think of what he called the triangle, the nexus between humanitarians, development, and peace actors. And the reason why he said this was important was because we need to do a better job of preventing conflicts and focusing in on the prevention piece. We've also heard in that context a lot of push from member states for more coherent approaches between actors and to stop putting band-aids on problems when we're dealing increasingly in protracted crises as humanitarians. So what are we talking about when we talk about peace and peace building? Hopefully today we'll hear a bit about terminology, because we've heard of things of prevention, peace building, sustaining peace, stabilization. So it'd be nice to get a little clarity of what we're talking about. Also, we've seen in the discussions on this nexus that looking at these different angles will provide opportunities for us all together collectively to have more holistic approaches to solving problems, maybe taking a more conflict sensitive programming approach, also maybe opening up new resources. We've also heard in discussions on the nexus challenges, including, as you'll hear today, about maintaining a humanitarian imperative that drives our decision, protecting the humanitarian principles. Some questions have arisen as we've talked about the nexus on how we engage in partnership. From an NGO network, we're quite interested in the principles of partnership, on working in complementarity with one another, and mutual respect towards results. And we've also seen within the NGO community, NGOs who are what we call multi-missioned, that aren't just doing humanitarian work, they're doing development, they're doing peace. So I think within a UN family that we've been engaging, there's a lot of lessons learned out there in the NGO community about what we can do to take a more collective and comprehensive approach. So that's just a little bit of framing for you of why we've decided to look at this topic today.
Thank you, Melissa. And for this discussion, we're very happy to have with us several panelists today. First of all, Scott Weber, who's Director General at Interpeace. He'll be providing an overview of peace building work in ongoing emergency contexts. Also, Anna Chernova, Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor at Oxfam, who will share some of the experiences of Oxfam and how they have been integrating peace building in their work as a multi-mandated organization. Following these two presentations, we're very pleased to have with us Rabia Nusrat, Regional Projects Manager at International Alert, who will be sharing her perspectives on how humanitarian organizations interact with peace building in emergency contexts, specifically in Asia. So now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Scott Weber to the line. He's the, as I mentioned, Director General of Interpeace, which is an independent international peacebuilding organization and a strategic partner of the United Nations. In this position, he provides strategic direction to the organization and oversees its operations in over 20 countries across Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East. So, Scott, very happy
Well,
to
thank you
give you
very
the
much.
floor.
Thank you, Anurad. Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Nishani, as well, for the opportunity to be engaging with all of you today. I'm also pleased to join Anna and Rabia as speakers today, and hope that after this brief presentation and exchange that we can have a lively debate on what is an important topic, but one that also generates, in my experience, a tremendous amount of unease, particularly from the humanitarian community as we engage with them all around the world. This is something where we need a lot more clarity on what is this nexus that we're talking about. And so I'm going to launch in. I'm going to go fairly quickly through the initial slides because they're more about Interpeace itself, and that's not the topic of the discussion, so we can get into the heart of the matter. So just a word, Interpeace was created by the UN back in 1994 to help the UN and the international community understand how to engage more effectively in conflict situations and to create more sustainable peace. Very quickly, we realized that the heart of the challenge was actually to create the internal capacities within these societies to manage their own peace processes. And that's what the focus of Interpeace has been ever since then. We're about engaging the societies themselves to take ownership of their own problems and to find the solutions from within. We became a hybrid UN NGO in the year 2000, and in January of this year became an international organization, the first international organization for peacebuilding, recognized by the Swiss government. We're currently operating into over 20 places, and indeed, as you'll see in the PowerPoint, we try to engage at the senior-most political level, at the sub-regional, sub-national level, and at the local level as well, and connecting the three, as you'll hear in a minute. We have a global presence, but the 5 key principles that guide our work are the following ones: local ownership being the critical one, and making that real. Because often we say that, and it's in every policy document, but we don't actually enact it. Building trust. The trust is actually the real challenge of building peace. You have to have processes that are inclusive of all groups, including the spoilers, including those at the extremes, because if they're part of the problem, they have to become part of the solution. That process matters, not just the outcome you're trying to seek, but how you get there is actually the critical issue, and we'll come back to that because that's the heart of the messaging around the nexus issue. And long-term commitment. We, in Interpeace, coined a term that we call Track 6, which is a combination connecting work at the 3 levels that I mentioned, at the senior government level, at the civil society level, and the Track 3 grassroots level, in an integrated strategy, because that's where senior policies and approaches by international organizations or governments can be best informed by the reality of on the ground and the ownership of those involved or those who will be affected on the ground. So everything that Interpeace does is in the Track 6 mindset. In terms of concepts, as Nusrat was talking about, it's important to understand what peacebuilding is all about. And peacebuilding is not about doing away with conflict. Our understanding is that conflict is natural in any society. The issue is how we manage conflict in nonviolent ways. In less violent societies, conflict exists, but it's dealt with in the courts or by the police or by other structures. But in many societies, those structures are not either present or legitimate or acceptable, and therefore actors take violent means to pursue their conflict. So the challenge of peacebuilding is not doing away with conflict. It's about managing conflict in nonviolent ways. And what peacebuilding tries to do is to build the capacities of society, what we call the formal and informal structures, to manage those conflicts nonviolently. That's what peacebuilding is all about. It's about strengthening the immune system of society to deal with the pathogens when they will arise, because they always do. Humanitarian action, I don't need to explain that to this group. I think we can skip that one and move on. Now, why are we talking about this? Why are peace builders involved in a discussion around humanitarian assistance at all? It's the fact is, and when I started in the UN system, the percentage of crises, humanitarian crises that were conflict related was closer to 20%. Today it's flipped. It's over 80%. Moreover, 2/3 of those crises are conflict related, protracted conflicts of 8 years or more. And that means that in those conflict situations, take the DRC, you have both the political actors cohabitating with humanitarian actors, cohabitating with development actors. And that creates a bit of a mess in terms of understanding, well, what comes first, what comes second, and how are we proceeding in a coherent way across those various dimensions. If I continue, also the nature of conflict is changing. I won't spend much time on this, but one, conflict is increasing, but two, the nature of conflict in terms of the number of non-state actors is also increasing. What I want to focus on this slide is primarily on the last point, which is that the crises have grown so much, and there are future ones on the horizon that I won't mention now, to such an extent that it's critical that we look at prevention. The Secretary General is focusing so much on prevention because he understands that the solutions are not humanitarian. The solutions are primarily political and developmental. How we get at that is going to be critical, but that I would argue humanitarian actors have a role to play on the prevention agenda. And we'll get into that in the next few slides. I'll skip this one. This has to do with the scale of the financial needs in terms of humanitarian assistance have ballooned to an extent where it's no longer actually financially viable to support those efforts. This is the critical slide I want to focus on. Interpeace has done a tremendous amount of work of late in the last 3 years to try to analyze what is this nexus. And we were commissioned by the 7 biggest donors to the humanitarian community to look into this in more depth and to ask the question, what is the longer-term impact of humanitarian assistance in these protracted conflict situations, protracted crises? What is the impact and the footprint of humanitarian assistance in the long run on the dynamics of trust and social cohesion and self-reliance of these communities? And the reason that we were asked that is that in terms of that triangle that the Secretary General talks about that's illustrated here in the slide, a lot of work has been done to analyze the humanitarian development connections and interrelation. A lot of work has been done as well on the peace building and development side of the triangle. But far less work has been done on the part of the triangle relating to the link between the humanitarian efforts and peace building to humanitarian efforts. That's the least explored part of the equation. Why? Because of this all-important humanitarian imperative and humanitarian neutrality that we all prize and that is absolutely necessary. And I want to start by saying Interpeace is not arguing for humanitarian actors to become peace builders. But what we have recognized in our work and in analyzing this dynamic in 3 different conflict settings at the request of these donors is that humanitarian actors do have a footprint on the dynamics of trust and cohesion and self-reliance of the societies in which they're working. And that they have no choice but to understand that footprint and to work on having a more positive footprint. That issue is of critical importance in understanding how do humanitarians relate to the overall objective of that nexus. Now, the reason why the nexus issue creates so much unease is that humanitarian actors feel that they're being forced into relationships with peace-building actors and development actors that actually undermine their neutrality and their ability to function in that humanitarian space. And that is a false dilemma. I think it's not a good understanding of how to pursue the nexus. We shouldn't see the nexus as a joined up set of objectives and work where we're going to be in the same project documents and in joint teams, et cetera, across those 3 dimensions. What we need to understand is how each of those 3 sectors contributes to an overall collective outcome of resilience of that society. That's the ultimate objective. That humanitarian work has a role to play in supporting or not the resilience to violent conflict of those communities, which means trust, social cohesion, and self-reliance. And that what we've seen in our research across those various conflicts, we've seen a lot of negative examples where humanitarian assistance is actually creating much greater dependencies, where it's actually displacing local capacities, and where it actually exacerbates the internal conflicts that exist in a conflict situation. Why is resilience in a conflict situation different from resilience in a natural disaster situation? Because in a natural disaster situation, the shock is an external shock. It's no one's fault that there's an earthquake, and it strikes a community, and it has a big impact on that community. In a conflict situation, the shock is an internal shock to relationships within society. Precisely those relationships that you need in order to deal with difficult situations. If we don't trust each other in a community, how are we going to work together to actually lift ourselves out of the situation? We can't. We don't trust each other. So when we look at resilience and how all of this supports resilience, we have to understand that it's a different kind of resilience in a conflict situation. And 80% of the cases are conflict situations. So how does humanitarian assistance actually enhance trust and social cohesion becomes a central question that the humanitarian community can no longer avoid. But it's also the answer to how they're supposed to contribute in their own space, separate from the other sectors, to that overall collective outcome of greater self-reliance and resilience of that society. So that's the key question that we're trying to answer. How can humanitarian assistance affect positively, rather than negatively, the ability of communities to be more resilient to violent conflict? And the question that we, and the answer that we found is that it's all in the way that the humanitarian community engages. How they choose to identify who they work with in the community, how much they're working through those who are already trusted in the community, not necessarily through the established leadership. We know that the humanitarian sector is by culture state avoidant, and yet by the way that they engage, they need to nevertheless help to rebuild trust between the people and their state gradually in the way that they do this. And all of this requires them to see their short-term assistance in a longer-term perspective of how is that community going to be managing its own affairs in the longer run, and how can what we bring in the short term help that to be improved. This is at the cornerstone of the ICRC's new strategy that they just put out, which in French they call inscrire l'urgence dans la durée, or how do we inscribe the urgent engagements into a longer-term perspective. IFRC is an example of an organization that already does this quite naturally because they are embedded in the society, so they're always thinking about how the short-term links to the long-term. But all actors need to put themselves in that perspective of trying to understand what they bring and how it will have a longer-term footprint on the relationships in society that are the ones that are affected by conflict dynamics. And so we've identified ways in which not that we should get humanitarian actors and development and peacebuilding actors working in tandem in common project documents, which is not the way it should go, nor that humanitarians should become peacebuilders, but they do need to shift their practice. They need to change the ways that they engage, the way that they determine what is going to be provided, who they work with, who they work through. Often the use of middlemen in these conflict situations where the humanitarian actors don't know who to trust, working through middlemen often creates the extra tensions and conflict in the community because no one trusts those middlemen. They're not the right people to be providing the assistance. But what is decided to be provided needs to be part of an engagement with the community where they feel a sense of ownership and working through people that they trust to be the interlocutors to determine how that should be done and who that should be done with. So essentially, how does humanitarian action working itself out of a job in the long run, how is it contributing to that longer-term resilience is the key question. And peacebuilders have a role to play in helping humanitarian actors understand the footprint that they're leaving and how they can have a more positive footprint on these societies. And that's what we're suggesting in terms of a series of partnerships that we're establishing at the moment with ICRC and IFRC and UNHCR to work with them, accompany them in self-analyzing their own actions and how they're contributing positively or negatively to that self-reliance of the community. Because ultimately, it's all about the relationships internally between the national actors, be they at the local level or between the people and their state. Ultimately, if we all want to work ourselves out of a job and if we want humanitarian action to contribute to prevention, it's really about how much we're contributing to those relationships of trust horizontally between groups and vertically between the people and the state. and how much we're contributing to those is the key issue. I'll stop there in terms of this initial presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Scott. A lot to unpack there. Before we move on to the next presentation, we did want to share with you some questions. We heard what you were saying when it comes to the unease in the humanitarian community about this, and that being at the heart of the matter. You're not arguing for humanitarians to be peace builders. Kim in Switzerland was asking a question that has been on our minds. How do peace-building actors feel about safeguarding the humanitarian principles?
Yeah.
What are you hearing on safeguarding humanity, neutrality, impartiality, independence, when it comes to working more towards aligned goals or collective outcomes? The word stabilization has come up in some contexts. I don't know if we've had a chance to unpack that one when it comes to terminology. Is it about stabilization, or is it more about community engagement? And Barbara in the US was building on this, talking about how practically we're supposed to be connecting up our planning frameworks when it comes to doing what you're envisioning here. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the principles and the terminology like stabilization versus community engagement
Thank
and
you.
the planning.
So how do peace builders feel about humanitarian principles? I think they feel strongly about them. The issue that we find pollutes the conversation is the fact that the humanitarian actors keep saying that what they do is apolitical. And while their objective should not be political, they have to recognize that they are operating in a hyper-political environment. And therefore, anything you do, just being present, is political. And that's you cannot ignore that, and you can't wish it away. You can't write a policy document that shields you from that basic truth that you are operating in a hyper political environment, and therefore you're having a footprint. You're displacing certain actions in a way that everything is looked through by local actors through a political lens. And you cannot ignore that. So that's a little bit where we find the discourse around neutrality to be important. Humanitarian principles are critical, but also the not to be naive about the fact that everything you do has a political influence and impact. And in that context, you have to understand how you can leave behind a more positive footprint. On the stabilization issue, a lot of peace-building work intersects with stabilization at the moment. The U.S. government just put out what I think is a landmark document that I really recommend as required reading across the community. It's done by the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction on the experience of the U.S. government in stabilization in Afghanistan. And it's 300 pages. This is a report commissioned by Congress. 300 pages that is absolutely excoriates the stabilization community's way of working and argues for precisely what I'm talking about, which is engagement, community engagement, in order to help the communities actually co-own and co-design the solutions that are going to be brought to them. And it's 300 pages of very sophisticated explanations of why the stabilization approach is often backwards and counterproductive. So I point people to that document as a enlightening one. The stabilization community has objectives that generally are carried out in a fairly technical way by hard security actors who are looking at the objective being to reduce the levels of violence in a fairly top-down manner, rather than looking at issues of legitimacy, rather than looking at issues of acceptance, at trust and cohesion, which are really the longer-term solutions to the issues that stabilization is trying to achieve. So we come full circle back to the same questions. The heart of the challenge of building a more peaceful society is building trust. And so it's not rocket science. How is anything that all of us are doing, be it in the development field, be it in the peace-building field, be it as stabilization community, be it as humanitarian actors, we have to have as our litmus test how it's all contributing to greater trust horizontally between groups, in relationships within communities and between communities, could also be between ethnic groups, and between the people and the state, which is one of the relationships that's the most broken in a conflict situation. In many conflict situations, the state is 80% of the problem. The state is often the predator in the conflict. In Guatemala, where the death toll was upwards of 250,000 in the Civil War, the state was responsible for over 90% of the human rights violations. So how do you start to trust the state again is a key question for the longer-term peace of these societies. And the humanitarian actors, whether they like it or not, and they have to look at themselves in the mirror and admit that they are by culture state avoidant. They try to say we're all about the victims, we're all about the people that need the help, but ultimately, by the way that they do that, they can also continue to undermine the rebirth of a relationship between the state and the people. But ultimately, that relationship needs to be rebuilt. And they can't continue to say that it's not their business. It is their business. If it's all about working yourself out of a job, if it's about humanitarian actors seeing their role in preventing, or rather in their own language, ending need, as we said at the Istanbul conference. So what does this mean in practice? This means that the humanitarian actors need to, in planning terms, not start by saying, I'm organization X, this is what we do, therefore let me come and see how much of it I can do. We need to start with engagements in the communities to understand what do they actually really need, and who in the community is trusted in order to determine with the community what that need really is. Two, it's to have as much of a focus on capacity assessment. What are the sources of resilience in the society, in the community, that already exist, so that when I come with whatever I'm bringing that has been determined with the community, it's not going to undermine capacities that exist. I'll give an example. In one community that we studied, an NGO came in and said, oh, there are many orphans in the community. We can handle that. We'll set up a program to deal with the orphans, not recognizing that as a result of coming together as a community to deal with their orphan issue, one of the women in the community had gained a tremendous amount of respect, dignity, and was empowered as a kind of problem solver in the community because she had organized the various mothers in the community to bring together a network to handle their orphan issue in a way that was very embedded in the community, that everyone felt worked well, etc. But when the outsiders came in, they said, oh, you have an orphan problem, we'll help you deal with it. And not only did they undermine the system that had been created, but they undermined the credibility of the woman who was now a local leader in solving other problems because of the credibility of how she had helped to deal with the crisis at its height. So we need to go in with lenses that are looking at a resilience assessment first. How have communities already solved their problems, and how can we enhance those solutions and complement them with what we can bring from the outside? But even what we bring from the outside needs to be designed with that community, engaging in a holistic way so that it's not going to be instrumentalized by any one group, which then will undermine those internal relationships again. So it's really all about how you engage before you start planning what you're going to do. And again, I say this, and this is a critical point, is that we work in only in conflict societies. When you put yourself in the shoes of a Somali or a Congolese or Libyan, like these situations where we work, it's all connected in their lives. All of this separation of what's stabilization versus development versus humanitarian is a bit of nonsense in their lives because it's all connected. So we need to stop looking at this situation through the lens of our own mandates, which is like a hammer looking for nails, and put ourselves in the shoes of the local communities and see how it's connected already in their lives, and then bring solutions that are in response to that natural integration, that natural coherence that comes from looking at it through their perspective. And when you do it from their perspective, what they need versus what they already have changes. It becomes much clearer how you need to build on what they already have developed as sources of resilience, not undermine them. And two, who you need to work with, who's trusted in the community to determine what needs to be brought and how. That's essentially what this is all about.
Thank you so much, Scott. Before we move on, I just need to ask you a clarifying question because, as we mentioned in the beginning, terminology is so important here. If we look at the report that you referenced, talking about the experience in Afghanistan, it talks about stabilization in one sentence. In the next sentence, it talks about building and reforming government institutions in Afghanistan. So could you please just clarify for our audience, what does stabilization mean? What is a term?
Again,
And how is it
it's a
distinct
very
from the
good
other
point.
pieces that we're talking
Stabilization
about?
is misunderstood to be essentially about creating order in society, which again is misunderstood by the actors who carry it out, who are primarily hard security actors. Because what they have, like I said, the humanitarian community has a state avoidant kind of mindset. The stabilization community has a state obsessed mindset. And what it becomes very quickly, stabilization is about restoring government functions in society. Now, the term that I would prefer that we use is state building. Because just like peace building is about strengthening the capacities of a society to manage conflict nonviolently, state building is about the relationship of trust between the state and the people. That's the heart of the matter of state building. And if you think about it that way, it's not just about government services. It's about how much people trust the government to be providing for the people's needs. An example from Liberia that we encountered when we worked there was that when it came to providing security, there was a security problem in Liberia. The answer of the international community was, oh, if there's a security problem, they must need police. And there was a tremendous amount of money invested through a stabilization agenda and a state building agenda, wrongly understood, to beef up the capacities of the National Police of Liberia and to deploy them all over the country, not recognizing that to Liberians in the communities, the police was the tool of oppression of Charles Taylor. And so putting more police in the streets or in the communities was a sign of threat to the community, not a sign of greater protection and greater justice and greater security. And so they actually attacked the police very often. So the issue is really around, I come back full circle to the issue, it's all about trust in the end. We're working on this in Mali at the moment and in Burkina Faso and the Sahel on the issue of how much can we restore trust between the state and the people through trust of the police. And it's not more deployments in the north of Mali that's going to bring greater security or more French troops that you can deploy in a stabilization mindset into northern Mali. It's going to be, as we engage with the communities in northern Mali, we asked them, why are you protecting and harboring extremist groups? And they said, and we asked them, is it because you agree with their point of view, with their political agenda? And they said, of course not. It's because we mistrust the state more. When the state rolls into town, more people are harassed and robbed and raped than when the police, when these extremists come into town. So they do the survival math. So the answer is going to be, again, about not how much do we strengthen state structures that the stabilization community is so obsessed with. It's about how much we do a state building, which is about the relationship of trust between the state and the people. And I'm arguing, and all the research we've done argues, that humanitarian actors in their humanitarian space, which we need to protect, have a role to play nevertheless in contributing to restoring that relationship over time between the state and the people.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Scott. Before we move on, I would like to just point out we've displayed the polls that we were running during your session, and I see we have some interesting results, which will be great to feed in to the briefing note that will come after the session. On the one hand, our audience, I think, validating many of the points that you were making regarding some of the unintended consequences of humanitarian response in the various contexts where they're working, undermining local capacities, undermining trust, and so on. But also a great collection of examples of good practice and positive impacts, positive experience. So thanks so much to all of you for sharing, and we look forward to incorporating those and distributing them more widely after the event. So now, with a great pleasure, I would like to invite Anna Chernova to the line. Anna has worked in conflict resolution, democratization, human rights, humanitarian aid, and development for nearly 20 years. Joining Oxfam in 2014, Anna has provided strategic steer on engaging in fragile and conflict-affected contexts on a range of humanitarian issues. She leads Oxfam UK's work on rights in crisis for Syria and Iraq, with a particular focus on human security, political economy, and supporting local capacities for peace. Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me well. It's a great pleasure to follow Scott because a lot of the points he made are both very close to Oxfam's perspectives on the nexus and also quite controversial within Oxfam itself. In many ways, the tensions Scott outlined are actually living within the wider Oxfam confederation. So it's great that this conversation is happening, and I'm very grateful to the organizers for convening us on this. We've been following the nexus for quite a long time, in part because it links to our multi-mandate work, as we're both humanitarian and development, and also because most of the people we work with live in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. So working in and on conflict is not new to us. What is relatively new to us is the explicit link the nexus is making and the potential implications that could have for the way we work in these contexts, and the way we engage with partners, and the way that our funding comes through this stream. One of the most important commitments we've made recently with regard to this were made at the World Humanitarian Summit. So a lot of the grand bargain conversations around local humanitarian leadership and improving aid effectiveness, humanitarian and development, are framed within those conversations, and I'll talk about those as well. In general, we welcome the nexus and the new way of working conversations, but there are some concerns, and like Scott mentioned, a lot of those concerns are with the humanitarian response teams, who really feel that some of the framing of the nexus could impact the way we respond to humanitarian crisis, and in particular with the principles of independence and neutrality. So I'll just lay out a bit what Oxfam is like as an organization and what this means for us. Just to put this in context, we're a big confederation. We're very decentralized. So we have many perspectives on this issue, depending on which Oxfam affiliate you speak to, which partner you speak to, which country context you speak to. And I'll do my best to reflect this in my presentation today. So a quick review of our mandate and our strategic plan. You can find our strategic plan online. It's fairly comprehensive, both in terms of our global goals, but also our internal change goals. It runs out next year, so we're in the process of revising it and updating, and we're hoping that the nexus conversation, including conflict sensitivity and peace, will also be part of that discussion and will be reflected in our new strategic plan. I just wanted to highlight a couple of things because it shows the scope of our work, and it speaks well to what Scott was describing as the natural tensions, especially humanitarians tend to have when it comes to dealing with the state and formal and informal power. So Oxfam's broad mandate is the power of people against poverty, which is why we work on a whole range of issues that may be perceived as potentially sensitive or potentially political. We're a rights-based organization, so that concerns both our humanitarian and development mandates. We always look through a rights-based lens, including a gender justice lens, and we do both reactive humanitarian response and long-term development work, which includes holding duty bearers to account, which of course is always sensitive and always state-centric, and sometimes it's friendly and sometimes it's not. And I'll give some examples later in the presentation. And one aspect of how Oxfam operates that's quite important to highlight is that we really view development as the progressive redistribution of resources and power between the have and the have-nots. So for us, it's not about ending poverty and working ourselves out of a job. For us, it's about solidarity, global influencing, social justice, equality, all of those things. So we want to create a situation where there is no need for humanitarian response and capacitate our local partners and populations living locally. But of course, what we're also aiming for is a global change, and that includes the humanitarian system and how communities are operating. Speaking to what Scott mentioned, it would be not rebuilding the state as it was before, but rebuilding a state that is equal and socially just. So each of our country programs has a vision that demonstrates what we would like our country, the countries that we're operating, to look like, and that is very closely linked to our mandate and vision for the world. Since we've been working on the humanitarian and development continuum for some time, a lot of what we have to say about the nexus and ways of working won't be new to many other agencies on the line, and we are still in discussions about some of our concerns and risks, and so I'll elaborate on those later. For those of you working on contexts that are highly militarized, which is also the case with Oxfam, one of the things I wanted to highlight here is that we find ourselves having to deal with lots and lots of issues that concern counterterrorism, violent extremism, bank de-risking that's linked to those issues, aid diversion, stabilization, and other issues that maybe we would normally not have to deal with, but we have to deal with because of compliance or because we're trying to make sure that our advocacy is constructive and doesn't cause harm, and that we're in line with what the local communities would like to see happen in their own environment. A few words about the scope of the work. You've seen probably Oxfam's work on Davos and G20. Oxfam does a lot of high-level advocacy, and we do our best to link our programs to that advocacy, in particular on local voice. Through this work, we really try to address drivers of conflict and fragility. So we alleviate pain through our humanitarian work, but we do try to also link this up to how we advocate globally with power holders, whether those are national or international. Because we believe in people power, this is collective action, which means humanitarian space and civic space for us are absolutely critical, both in terms of how we operate, but also how we work with our partners and what kind of societies we would like to see. And that work is reflected in our aid effectiveness work, in what we've said and done with regard to the Charter for Change. And like Scott pointed out, Oxfam is not alone in this. What we say about local humanitarian leadership and how effective we are at achieving it are usually two different things. And so it's great that this conversation is happening and more conversations about this particular aspect are happening, because big INGOs have a very hard time changing and making true to their commitments on the localization commitment. So it's very good to see that happening. I wanted to quote something from our Yemen work here. We've done some research on why it's important to look at long-term issues while you do humanitarian assistance. Yemen is one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. And one thing we found is that working on gender justice and equality in parallel to humanitarian programming is absolutely critical to resolving conflict and long-term stability in Yemen. So we found that to be absolutely true, both with our partners and as an INGO. So I think Scott's very much right about looking forward and not focusing too much on what we have to offer, but what the communities need. Another good example of what we've done is in Oxfam, Lebanon, which is middle income, highly fragile country with the Syria crisis. It makes it a very interesting case study for how things work when you try to blend humanitarian and development assistance. In our case, because we are multi-mandate, we realize that it challenges us to apply the nexus, whether or not we like it, but also to know where it should be separated if we want to preserve our humanitarian imperative, particularly when it comes to protection issues. And I'm happy to speak more on that if there are questions. On Oxfam's broader approaches to peace. So we're not a peace-building agency per se, but we are, a conflict-sensitive agency. So supporting local capacities for peace and do no harm are a very important aspect of what we do. And so the points you see here just broadly outline how are some of the ways that we approach peace within Oxfam. The mainstreaming and transformational programming we try to build, how we try to avoid silos and to make sure that we invest in our M&E and our learning processes, how we try to avoid linear approaches to aid, and how we apply a systems approach, which is something we always do, but we place particular emphasis on this when we're working with conflict, particularly working with formal and informal power. Also something that Scott mentioned for NGOs is particularly challenging. And there you have the list of the type of tools that Oxfam uses, and the organizers have kindly offered to share some of the documents that I've provided, which are publicly available, so you can read about what Oxfam's methodologies are like. In terms of engaging in particularly sensitive conflict contexts that are well documented. So, for example, the situation with ISIS in Iraq. This is one of the areas where we've had to do in-depth research on conflict dynamics through a gender lens and also through a social cohesion lens. And we have done this at a time when Iraq has moved into reconstruction and it became the focus of the agenda. So even though we responded to the situation in Iraq in 2014, 2015, purely with a humanitarian mandate, we have found ourselves looking more and more to longer-term issues, because without social cohesion, we can neither deliver on our humanitarian mandate nor really make true in the assistance we would like to provide to Iraqi civil society in the long term. And I can speak on that more if there are questions. I was particularly asked by the organizers to mention internal structure and organization. Because Oxfam is a confederation, it's very difficult to make a general comment about what's humanitarian and what's development. What I will say is that we have different types of funding streams, which I will elaborate on in a bit, but we try to prioritize along the lines that you see there. We focus on the Global South. We have put our headquarters in Nairobi. We have a number of affiliates who focus on different thematic issues, and they offer that as their partnership offer to our confederation. I can highlight here the Dutch Oxfam Novib and the Danish Oxfam ICVA, who both particularly focus on conflict and fragility and peace-building work. Oxfam Novib in particular focuses on the local humanitarian leadership agenda, civic space, and ICVA focuses on education in fragile and conflict-affected contexts. We also have a massive global advocacy network, which you've probably come across in a number of capitals. And then we fund these things and structure these things according to critical humanitarian need and where we can also be effective in making impact. We try to be as local as possible and as international as necessary. That's our attempt to meet our commitments in the World Humanitarian Summit and stay closer to our mandate. I'll skip over this very quickly if you don't mind, because I think there's quite a lot of people on the line that also will be familiar with South Sudan context, and very happy for them to contribute to see how they view this. But in South Sudan and Yemen are two places where Oxfam has worked on both humanitarian response and peace-building efforts, and I've shared publications where you can read about how that's worked and how the advocacy has progressed, and happy to answer questions. In terms of our funding structure, since there was a particular question to that, I wanted to highlight something that maybe isn't popularly known or used by other agencies, and that's something that's called the catastrophe fund, and that's where we put unrestricted resources in a pooled fund so that we can release those if there's a new emergency or a particular need that institutional donors may not be willing or able to release to us quickly enough. That gives us the surge capacity we need, the policy and advocacy capacity we need, and helps us invest in longer-term vision. And we have some good examples of where that's worked particularly well. The rest of our funding structure will be very similar to other big INGOs, so I won't dwell too much on that. In terms of natural hazards or conflict, I just wanted to highlight a couple of moments also that Scott has mentioned. Yes, it's no one's fault there's an earthquake, but if there's a huge power imbalance of how, of course, government actors and private sector actors respond to an earthquake. And that's true in Western countries and in Eastern countries, in developed countries, and countries that are fragile and conflict affected. And in that case, I would encourage people to read the No Accident report, which looks at inequality and vulnerability and building resilience, and highlights that it is different. Their natural disaster in a highly unequal, corrupt environment is very, very different than a natural disaster somewhere else, and questions, in fact, whether or not anything is a natural disaster considering the impact of climate change. Just briefly on Oxfam on the nexus. For us, because we have these two mandates, we have a natural internal tension. Are we humanitarian? Are we development? Are we both? Which one is more important? That tension always tends to come out also in policy and advocacy work. And a lot of the big INGOs on the call will find this familiar. We try to think and work politically because we work on power, and we try to engage with plenty of stakeholders. And one of our criticisms of the nexus is that it doesn't engage with enough of those, doesn't give civil society enough voice. And the other aspect is that it doesn't give enough of a gender lens to this kind of work. Funding streams is a concern because we want to make sure that more money goes to our local partners, civil society partners, in humanitarian crisis and in development response. And that's one of the reasons why we're concerned about the state-centric approaches that some of the comprehensive nexus methodologies could bring. Maybe they haven't brought it yet, but they could. And we actively engage the peace-building sector. We think that's very healthy in terms of making sure we do no harm and that we are relevant in the communities where we work. In terms of challenges, I'm happy to take this more in questions in the interests of time, but I just want to highlight this one particular issue. We have found that the raising voice and in a conflict setting to allow civil society actors, especially women's voice, to be present on the humanitarian principles is particularly difficult. And one aspect of that is the state-led, state-centric approach. So when we worked on the Supporting Syria conference in London, the photo you see there, the young woman runs a organization helping Syrians in Lebanon. And one thing that she very bravely put to the UN Secretary General at the opening of this conference is that if we are looking at permission for everything we do in trying to implement protection-led humanitarian approaches, then there's something wrong with our system. And that was central also to the World Humanitarian Summit, that it's very difficult to maintain humanitarian imperative when we have such a strong concentration on state-centric approaches, national security, and securitization, including among some of our biggest donors. And just very quickly, some learning for the sector. Mandates and theories of change are very, very important, we found. Not because you should do what your mandate says, but because it helps you analyze whether or not you're causing harm. Those of you that work in peace building will be very familiar with the do no harm framework. And basically what it does is it tries to identify some of the ways a humanitarian actor, in our case, for example, is contributing to dividers and tensions, or contributing to connectors and local capacities for peace, and helps us identify options. This is an exercise we've done in Syria, and we found it extremely useful to make sure that we're not causing harm, both through transfer of resources, economic harm, but also through legitimization and engaging with state and non-state actors that could be very strongly party to the conflict. In terms of looking ahead for us in the nexus, we're very interested to see what institutional donors will do, because they tend to set a lot of the agenda, and how we manage this risk and the risk for civil society space in influencing the nexus debate. And I think this particular webinar is a great example of what kind of conversations we need to have more of at all levels, from countries to headquarters and in different spaces. And just in closing, one thing I would like to add, that for Oxfam, we need to be looking at what a nexus for whom. You know, we're not here to serve ourselves as operational NGOs. We are here to make sure that we deliver to the maximum possible ability on our mandate on inequality, social justice, and alleviating suffering in humanitarian responses. So it's very, very important for us to remember what are we actually trying to achieve through this debate, and engage on this, working together and finding common solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. I was going to ask you a question from Jane in Kenya, who wanted to talk about gender and social cohesion, but you did a good job touching on that. So instead, since you started by mentioning the controversy, I would like to ask you a controversial question. The question is anonymous. It says, how much of the resistance from humanitarian actors is due to resources being diluted from pure humanitarian into the nexus? So maybe a resource diversion. How much of it?
I think that's a very valid concern. If I look at the countries I've been working with, and in particular sitting in the UK, engaging with British donors and watching how the UK spends its ODA, that is a very serious concern. With more and more funding going to private sector actors, with militarization of aid, which is a very real risk, including with British funds, but also with EU trust funds, that is a very serious concern. The Nexus could contribute to that. There is some evidence of it contributing to it already, which is why the humanitarians are raising it. But whether or not the outcome will be that, I think remains to be seen, which is why it's really important that people who are doing humanitarian work on the ground, local and international, have a real voice in this process. But I have seen funds diverted or attempted to be diverted by institutional donors from things that should be independent of the state, because the state may be a belligerent or because the state is incapable of delivering, and have seen those funds diverted to stabilization efforts, or what I would really classify more as security related efforts, including security that really focuses on the security of the donor rather than the security of the community that we are discussing. And I think the migration debate is an excellent example of that. If we look at how the big Western donors, particularly in Europe, are spending their money on the migration crisis, as they call it, we really see that they're securing their own national borders and their own national security, and they're not really focusing enough on what is good development practice.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up on that. Have you seen anyone tracking that, to track that funding flow?
There was, when the UK tried to change its definition of ODA recently, there was some attempts to at least look at the bilateral donors. I think that might be a little bit easier because so much gets diluted when we look at EU joint donorship and the relationship with External Action Service. So I think looking at it globally would be difficult to put a number on it, just like we struggle to put a number on how much of global aid goes to local actors and things like that. But I haven't seen anything global that would indicate a number. What I have seen is people evaluating their own home donors and saying that there is very much a very viable risk of this. And Oxfam's publication on the EU Africa Trust Fund has some data on that.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. Once again, I'd like to just very quickly before we move on, point out a couple of interesting results in the polls that we see here. So we asked for your opinions regarding which types of organizations you think will either benefit from an additional focus on work in the Nexus or be disadvantaged. And interestingly, there seems to be an overwhelming majority believing that local organizations and civil society will be most affected. However, that is split 50-50 between people who believe they will be most disadvantaged and those who believe they will be most advantaged. So I think more thinking and more work to go into that question, but clearly we're hitting on a point where there's some debate and different perspectives. So now moving on to our final presentation on our panel, I'd like to introduce Rabia Nusrat. Rabia is International Alerts Regional Projects Manager for South Asia, currently overseeing and developing Alerts network work in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The focus of her work over the past 6 years with International Alert has been on engaging with the business sector on peace-building, conflict-sensitive employment programs, and the role of diaspora social enterprises to support reconciliation efforts and conflict-sensitive media reporting, with a particular focus on minority rights and religious extremism. Rabia, I believe we have you on the line there. I'd like to give you the floor. Over to you.
Waiting for the presentation to come on, but I think I'll start off by talking about the question that was posed to the last speaker. It's interesting because it was asked that how much of the resistance from humanitarian actors is due to resources being diluted, and I think that conversation is also happens within the peace building sector. But for example, this is what we saw, for example, in Nepal, that when the earthquake happened, a lot of money was diverted from post sort of conflict reconstruction efforts towards humanitarian crisis. This is what happens in Bangladesh. So I think it's interesting to hear the other side's perspective, but I think we also share the same concern from a peace building sort of lens. Can you hear me okay now? Just wanted to check.
Yes, it sounds fine. Do we need to make an adjustment, Marcus, to the microphone? Okay. If you
Okay.
could possibly speak a little bit further away from the microphone, just a little bit, that
So
would be helpful.
yeah,
Thank
let
you
me
so much.
start by thanking you for this opportunity. My name is Rabia Nusrat. I am International Alerts Regional Project Manager for Pakistan, Afghanistan, and also oversee work in Sri Lanka. International Alert is a peace-building organization. We have been around for over 30 years now, and we work at, again, as was mentioned by Scott in his presentation, we also work like Interpeace at sort of different levels. So at the very grassroots level to all the way up to sort of supporting peace process at the very high national level. The number of countries that we work in go up and down. So we work between 24 to 30 countries, and we have offices in 18 countries. The way sort of alert works on sort of peace building is through lots of sort of the focus is to sort of address root causes and drivers of conflict, but we work on it through lots of thematic areas as entry points. So for example, working with the economic sort of sector, as was mentioned also in the introduction. We also do a lot of work with the private sector, engaging them for peace building, but a lot of work are also ensuring that economic development contributes to peace building. Then we also sort of do work around crime, violence, and instability. So understanding sort of that kind of nexus, but then also seeing what could be the entry points. Another sort of key area of our work is looking at climate change and natural resource management, and how that sort of works out in conflict-affected areas, and how can that be used for more peace-building opportunities, and various sort of other sort of entry points. And gender is a cross-cutting theme for us, but also sort of a thematic area that we specifically work on, and I'll talk about that in my presentation a bit more. And then conflict sensitivity as a peace-building organization is a cross-cutting theme for us. So I think the way Alert sort of has been looking at this nexus is, I mean, we of course, given the spaces that we work in, we have been interacting and working a lot with the development sector, but I think over the years there's also been a lot of realization. But also, I mean, and sort of to be quite honest, we're also querying this ourselves. That how do we also engage with the humanitarian actors, and what could be the value addition that we could sort of bring to the table. And it's as much as how the humanitarian actors can work with us, but also how we can also so the learning, we're looking at learning from on both ways. And then sort of and also similar to, I think, other organization with the World Humanitarian Summit happening, we also got involved in a lot of consultations to sort of see what could we offer to that. And a lot of our, and I'll come to that later in a next slide, but a lot of our country offices and field offices, a lot of work already going on in sort of working on this nexus. I think this has been sort of repeated in the previous two speakers' slide, that now a lot of the humanitarian action is in conflict situations. So I think that is sort of quite clear that there's a need for both actors, or the sort of the three actors, I think, in some ways, to come together. And there's also a very interesting report that I also came across. I think it's just being released by ODI, which actually looks at disaster risk reduction in context of violence, conflict, and facility specific in Asia. And a lot of sort of it's very interesting to see that almost a third of the countries which were sort of if you look at sort of 2018 kind of before that, a lot of work was a lot of sort of humanitarian crisis within Asia are in the countries which are on top of sort of the fragility kind of index. So you're looking at Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, so Sri Lanka and Timor-Leste. So sort of that sort of is quite clear that there is that need is there, particularly within the Asian context. But I think as the as the ODI report also says that it sort of focused on looking at the Sendai framework, but that sort of angle or recognition seems to be missing by sort of humanitarian frameworks to how do you take this conflict and fragility into account when you're working in these contexts. Now, and I think it's also, I think it is also good to see that a lot of positive examples were shared by different people. That how sort of where there were lots of positive examples how that where humanitarian assistance could do potentially good, but unfortunately there's also the danger that it can also do a lot of harm. And we have been working in Nepal for a very long time, and this is what sort of we saw in Nepal when the earthquake occurred, and then the responses to it. We sort of our assessment, and there's also a report that Alert has published on that, so that's available online for people to look at. But in some ways, it sort of reinforced the caste-based inclusion within the country, and Dalits, which were already sort of on sort of the poor, one of the poorer communities, they were the ones who got affected most by the conflict. Their houses were damaged more, but because of sort of already the exclusion that they were facing and all, because all the local response network, they responded more on the kinship basis, they again got left out. Then also in the government response, official documents are very, very important, and you needed those to access support and relief that the government or other agencies were providing. And when because as I said, this community got affected the most with sort of destruction of houses and stuff. They also did not have those documents, so they got again affected more, and sort of that sort of deepened the grievances, already existing grievances within the country. And then also, I think if you speak to our colleagues in Mali, they also say that transport around procurement, they saw that sort of further help empower some power brokers. So just to make the sort of reinforce the point that was made earlier, that there needs to be it would be more helpful if there was a better understanding of the context, or sort of having a conflict analysis before any efforts were made into these contexts. And this slide, tells you a bit more of possible negative effects that humanitarian assistance can have on conflict. But while recognizing, given the examples that have been shared, that there are also possibilities of positive effects. So I won't go into sort of reading the details on the slide, but I think this has been talked about. Then I think what sort of 3 or 4 things that we sort of were sort of discussing internally, but what sort of came to our sort of knowledge after the consultations that we did for the WHS or were part of was, again, I think the point that Scott made quite clearly, that key objections from the humanitarian community is that that engagement with peace builders will compromise their humanitarian principles, which are humanity, neutrality, independence, and impartiality. But I think, again, as the point that Scott was also making, that in the context that now you see most of the humanitarian crisis in, humanitarian actors are engaged in highly political activities. So, for example, my sort of conversations with people in Afghanistan, to access different areas, they have to negotiate with different actors. But I think what has become more complicated, and which unfortunately has resulted in some actors pulling out from certain areas, are because the actors now, in the non-state actors or the actors that they had to negotiate with, have multiplied now. So unless and until you have a full sort of or some kind of a conflict analysis or an actor mapping available, there's a danger that you could negotiate with one actor, but then you haven't taken into account the other one, and then unfortunately the staff has come under attack and stuff. So but also looking at sort of how you procure resources, and then also it's also interesting sort of looking at the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar at the moment, that sometimes even recognizing that there's a crisis and recognizing any ethnic group means that you are sort of behaving in a political way. So that I think just to speak to sort of that apprehension that even if you don't acknowledge it, unfortunately, the current sort of context are such that you have to end up being engaged in highly political activities. However, what we would say is that it's, however, possible to think politically without being political. And I think that's what also the definition that Scott also explained was that peace building is not about taking any sides. We, I think, as a community, pride ourselves in working with everyone. But that doesn't mean that we are not aware or we don't think politically and are aware of the context that we are working in. Then the second interesting thing that sort of came out was, again, as was said earlier also, and examples showed that humanitarian actors are already engaged in activities that can or do contribute to peace building. Interestingly, a lot of them work with host communities to ensure conflict prevention. Lots of emphasis is sort of made on emergency education to sort of, so that the young population that you're dealing with, they haven't lost that education opportunity, and then they can be better prepared to start their education and then employment opportunities. So those examples again exist, how they end up supporting IDPs or refugee returns for refugee or returnees, could add a lot to social cohesion. So it's not that they're not already doing these activities. It's probably if the thinking of the two sort of communities come together, it probably could be done in a much more effective way. But I think the challenge that we saw was that, there is a lot of this is done on ad hoc kind of basis. There's no strategy or sort of a framework which could sort of link these activities or could link the two frameworks together. So that's maybe where conversations need to happen and more effort needs to sort of go in. And then the other sort of challenge that we saw was that capacity is also an issue, and there's a need to we talk because our sort of in some ways bread and butter is conflict sensitivity. So we already have that capacity, but we could probably lend that to humanitarian organizations a bit more. And one thing I also wanted to sort of raise here as the conversation was happening that came to my mind was that, we also, when we talk about conflict sensitivity and conflict analysis, it's just not external to the organizations themselves. So, for example, after sort of the earthquake, in the aftermath of the earthquake in Kashmir in 2005, lots of humanitarian actors went in to provide humanitarian assistance. Similarly, in Sri Lanka after the tsunami, lots of actors went in to respond. But the people who went to respond from humanitarian organizations, they unfortunately there were also complaints that they did not understand the culture that they were deployed in, and that in some cases caused a lot of resistance or sort of lots of conflicts with the communities, and there was sort of a breakdown of the trust there. So, when we I was thinking about it when the other two presentations were happening, that it's just not when we talk about organizations, but we're also talking about individuals, and that also goes for the peace building community. So, I as a peace builder, I'm not applying a conflict sensitive lens for my work, but I need to apply it sort of on myself. And then I think we sort of in our experience of working in various contexts already are sort of seeing this collaboration happening. So lots of, when in the aftermath of the Nepal earthquake, our Nepal office worked with the sector, so they produced a practitioner guide. There was a lot of engagement with the humanitarian coordination group. Then in Lebanon, for example, we have done work with the UNHCR health program, looking at how could you sort of give health workers conflict resolution skills, because they're dealing with host communities as well as refugees, and there's a tension there because who gets access now. In that setting. We're also, for example, working with NRC in DRC. So, those sort of collaborations we already see happening. And another interesting thing that we see is that, you know, there seems to be sort of like a demand for support from humanitarian practitioners on sort of things like conflict sensitivity, procurement, employment, and how can you do conflict analysis, how can you integrate that into need assessments. But we somehow found a disconnect between the headquarter level and the field level. So the field staff is much more, I guess, open to this because they deal with these situations on a day-to-day basis, while I think the headquarter was still sort of showing a bit more resistance towards this. So yeah. And then I think also a realization that we sort of felt as we did these consultations and this work was that we also probably within the peace building community need to think about the language that we are applying in this context. So, you know, should we be more talking about the concept of community resilience to conflict rather than talking about peace building, or you know, so what kind of language would be more appropriate that will also help humanitarians do their work and sort of still collaborate with the peace building community. Yeah, and I think the last point again, going back to the report that that Scott also mentioned in his presentation about the cigar report. I think it's very interesting because we did a research last year, and Afghanistan was one of the case studies where we went and spoke to sort of we went and looked at the impact of conflict in civil society development, or how the civil society sort of shapes up in certain conflict contexts. And it was really interesting because one of the things that came up again and again was engagement, and how international actors are engaging with local organizations, but also with communities. So I think there's a lot more thinking that needs to be done there in terms of engagement as this sort of conversation goes forward. So I'll stop there and take any questions.
Thank you so much, Rabia. We are running short on time, but I did want to flag a question that we have just received from Adam in the UK. And it's about the idea of being self-reflective. So the question is, what are the shortcomings of the peace-building actors, international NGOs? Can we have a bit of self-reflection? Humanitarian actors too easily regarded as failing on do no harm, for example, failing to do context analyses. Are peace-building organizations really so much more?
No, I mean, I totally agree with you that we also need to be very sort of self-reflective and critical of our own sort of work, because we, I think, are at a much higher risk of failing, and you know, given the context that we work in, given that the context that we work in are changing so quickly. So that's why sort of when I started this, I made a point that we are also quite keen to learn from. I think we're also quite keen to learn from the humanitarian actors, because they also carry a lot of information that can add a lot of value to the conflict analysis, for example, that we would do. So I totally agree with you that we also probably fail more times than any other actors, given the nature of the work that we do.
Thank you so much, Rabia. We have a bit of time for questions, maybe 2 questions. So the next question I would pose to Anna from Oxfam, because Oxfam has been so engaged in the process leading up to the Global Compact on Refugees and the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which we received questions about, for example, from Elizabeth in Uganda, which was talking about linking to peace building with refugee communities, and they've been receiving little attention. Lillian in Kenya asks, how do you engage in a refugee camp community who are uprooted from their home states? How do we engage the hosting state for peace building for refugees? Is it possible?
That's a very good question and a very good point. When it comes to the nexus and the new ways of working, the comprehensive approach bringing those three elements together is seen in some ways a positive because it allows us to talk about, it gives us more space to talk about the host communities. So not just those displaced, but also those communities that host them. And more often than not, the communities hosting either internally displaced or refugees are actually the poorer communities, either because that's where you can afford to rent shelter, or because that's where the state or whoever holds power puts you. So it's very, very important to look at the refugee and displacement questions intersectionally, and the Nexus allows us to do more of that. Of course, it also comes with some risks, and the compacts are trying to address these elements. In terms of working with host communities and refugees in situations where people have been displaced either across a border or far away from where they come from, we found that it really differs whether people are in camps or whether they're in temporary settlements. So we've had some conversations with like Lebanon, for example, where it's quite easy to engage between host communities and refugees. There's a natural link on municipalities. We've been able to do research and publish on that, versus lots and lots of context in Africa where they wanted to replicate that. But we found that it's more complicated, also because there's this high concentration of disenfranchised groups, and quite often the government is a bit nervous about collective action in those types of settings. Also because if people are in camps, they're not that connected to the local community. Quite often the camps are, removed from the local market dynamics and things like that. So it's quite context specific. But we have recognized this for many years now to be very, very important. And we've run a number of programs, but also advocacy efforts to bring those two issues together.
Thank you so much, Anna. Cognizant of time, I'd like to throw the final two-part question to Scott. Pamela from India asks, how does this work in long-running conflicts that are driven by outside actors as well as internal actors? How does this work? And relatedly, Mohammed in Turkey was asking, how can humanitarian actors play a role in peace building in a conflict like Syria, where civil society organizations are considered to be a threat in regime-controlled areas?
Okay. Thank you, and it's been fascinating listening to the other colleagues' presentations, and there's a lot of synergy in what we were talking about. I think on the first question, can you repeat it? The first one?
Yes. So does this, what you're talking about, does it work where we see outside actors playing a role in the conflict?
Most of the big conflicts today are essentially chessboards of foreign actors as well. And we can't ignore that the local actors alone, even if they have to be in the driving seat of the solutions, because ultimately this is their country and they have to live with each other, they can't solve it alone anymore because outside actors are so engaged in disrupting the situation to favor one group or another on the ground. That's just the reality of the situation. Now, we've been engaged in places like Somalia since 1994, 95, helping to stabilize Somalia by engaging the Somalis to be the ones to drive their state building and peace building agenda. And a few years back, Interpeace's director in Mogadishu became the first president of Somalia after 21 years, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed, based on the work of actually getting Somalis together to build the peace from below and build states from the ground up. And I cite the example of Somalia, which is making progress gradually. Why? Because ultimately Somalia was a chessboard as well, and in a certain way is again a chessboard of foreign interference. But the only solution to pushing back on foreign involvement is actually the social cohesion and political cohesion of the internal actors. We work in Libya on the ground. We have a big team in Libya. One of the few things that all Libyans agree to is that they don't want outsiders telling them what to do. They don't want to be dictated and remote controlled from abroad. That doesn't mean that they don't invite foreign actors to support their various agendas, but they can all agree that they want Libyans to be governed by Libyans. And I think that's the key issue. How can we get the pushback on the international interference to come from within, based on a common understanding, a common agreement on how the national actors are going to govern their country? An example of this at the more local level is that if you look at the parts of Somalia that have fallen to Shabab, or if you look at the parts of Somalia of Libya that at the time had fallen to Daesh, what were they? They were communities that were internally divided, where you had tensions that were keeping the communities from banding together. What did al-Shabaab or Daesh do in those situations? They look for those vulnerable communities. They exacerbate the internal tensions to the point where it spills over into violence, and then they take over in the chaos. They have that as a deliberate, strategic approach. And so the best, when we started to do what we call peace mapping, all conflict resolution organizations like International Alert and Interpeace, we do conflict mapping. But what Interpeace started to do 15 years ago is peace mapping as well. It's to look in a conflict situation, where is it not burning and why? How did they solve problems already themselves without anybody's help? And analyzing those situations it's much more illustrative and instructive than looking at the parts that are burning. When you look at the parts that are stable in a conflict situation, guess what? It's that internal social cohesion and trust that was at the heart of the solution. So if we're thinking about these situations being chessboards of foreign interference, the best pushback on that, the best solution is actually internal coherence of the local actors to demand that the outsiders get lost, essentially. So that's how I would that's where I would put my my emphasis. The second question is in a situation like Syria, where the NGOs are treated like the enemy, like the opposition in a sense. I think we have to get very creative in situations like this and look at first not how can outsiders bring aid to Syria, but rather how are Syrians already solving problems, meeting humanitarian needs themselves without anybody's help. Again, do a bit of a peace mapping situation, do a bit of a resilience assessment rather than a needs assessment. How are Syrians in this awful, god-awful situation already meeting each other's needs, even if it's poorly? And build off that. See how to channel support to them so that it reinforces the solutions that they're already bringing. That's how I would start in such a situation, and not look at working necessarily through structures that are going to be politicized or targets of one side or another, but rather look at what are the informal networks that are solving problems, what are the more local scale community-based solutions that are being found that don't have an organizational structure around them. One of the challenges for all of us to figure out, and increasingly in these fragmented societies, is how can we support positive change when it doesn't come with an institutional structure that has 3 years of audited accounts and a governance system that we can verify that our donor funding is going to be used effectively, et cetera, et cetera. We have to be much more creative and flexible at finding ways of channeling support to informal structures, to networks, to the ways that communities are actually solving problems, even if they don't have a structure around them like the ones that we're used to. Because that's the reality of how problems are being solved today. And we're tying our own shoelaces together by requiring certain standards. And the donors are pushing hard on this because of accountability pressures from their own constituencies. I understand that. But we have to get much more creative. The world is more fragmented, and we have to get more agile and more effective and creative at how we're going to help real solutions, endogenous solutions, to be supported, even when they don't have the formalized structures that DFID might require in their log frames. And that's just the reality of these very difficult, complex situations today.
Thank you so much, Scott. There's clearly so much more to say on this topic. Very unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap things up now for today. However, we will be trying to follow up unanswered questions with our speakers after the event. So in that way, we can hopefully share some additional responses, some additional content with everyone who participated in the discussion today. Before we wrap things things up, I would like to do a quick round. I know we're just over our time, but we'll do a very quick round for 30-second final remarks from each of our speakers, first to Rabia, then to Anna, and finally to Scott. So Rabia, very brief, any closing thoughts you'd like to share with us?
Well, I think I'll probably echo what Scott just said, which is on a positive note, that it's as important to look at connectors within communities as to the resilient factors as much as there is to do a conflict analysis. And then finally, I mean, this needs to be looked at as a complementary sort of an effort between the two sectors, and the peace building sector can learn as much from it as what we can offer to the humanitarian sector.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks so much for being with us, Rabia. Now, over to you, Anna.
Yes, to also end on the opportunity note, I would say we really should look at this nexus conversation as a way to make sure that we focus on the nexus for whom, that we focus down on the conflict-affected populations that need our support. And like was already mentioned, look at rebuilding that social contract, and not just a social contract that is unfair or unjust, but a social contract between the citizen and the state that offers fair and accountable societies to thrive in these conditions. And I think all of our organizations are working towards that. Thank you.
Great, thank you, and thanks to you, Anna, for being with us today in this discussion. And then, last but not least, Scott, over to you for a brief.
Thank you so much. I mean, I wanted to just add a couple points. One is, and my own colleagues within the peace building community, let's say, are split between two camps. One that believes that peace building is a sector of work, and the second camp, which I belong to very much, is that peace building is how we do everything else well. It's how we do governance well. It's how we do humanitarian assistance well. It's how we do everything, essentially, in a way that's inclusive, in a way that builds trust. And so that's why I'm not a big proponent of getting the peace building community and the humanitarian community to work together. My main message is that the humanitarian actors need to understand how what they do leaves a mark, leaves a footprint on these societies, and that there's no choice, because they're conflict related, there's no choice but to reflect on how they affect the relationships of trust in society. And that by the way that they do their work, peace building is all about the how they do their humanitarian work can leave a positive or negative footprint on those relationships. And that is their contribution to the peace building and prevention agenda, let's say. The last thing is that if you put yourself in the shoes, as Anna keeps saying so rightly, if you put yourself in the shoes of the local actors in any of these countries, it's all integrated. We are, on the outside world, stuck in these silos that are mandate-driven silos where we see the world through the lens of what we do. And that's wrong. We have to put ourselves in the shoes of the local actors and see how does this all connect in their lives day to day. It's all naturally connected. It's all political as well in their lives. You can't ignore the fact that it's all political. And when you do that, it all becomes clearer about how we have a role to play from the outside at bringing complementary solutions to what they're already doing, at the resilience that they already have. We should be an add-on, not this focus of the resilience work. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. Thanks once again to our whole panel. We look forward to following up with you after today to keep the discussion going. I would like to inform all of our participants that the recordings and all of the mentioned resources, and there have been many coming up in the chat, will be available within the next few days on the event webpage. Also, once the transcript has been translated, ICVA will also be providing subtitles to the recordings in French
ICVA will later be
Arabic.
putting together a briefing paper on today's discussion to help those who want to follow up. I would like to present our fifth and final topic of this learning stream on September 11. We'll have the last session on the nexus. And we're going to be turning to the perspectives from the donor community. So Scott just said, put ourselves in the shoes of the local community. We found in our March annual conference on navigating the nexus that donors also have a lot to do with the nexus and how we are being resourced to look at the nexus. So we would like to have you join us for the discussion on how donors are approaching issues for example, how they see humanitarian development and peace work coming together at all phases of the program cycle, which includes assessment, planning, prioritization, programming, funding allocations. Also, how do they view the humanitarian principles, the SDGs, and UN reform in this context? And how are they considering to reform their own funding behaviors to enable the changes they would like to see? It comes to the issue of incentives that we talked about earlier. It comes to the issue of trust and accountability. So please already register if you can by clicking on the banner.
Right. Thank you very much, Melissa. Once again, a pleasure to co-host alongside with you. I'd like to thank finally our participants for their active involvement, very interesting questions, our speakers for their valuable inputs on the topic, to invite all of our participants to please fill in the feedback survey that you'll see after the event closes, and then also to thank all of our colleagues who are here behind the scenes making everything work, Nishani from ICVA, as well as Marcus and Sheila from PHAP. Thanks so much to everyone. This is Anne Lang signing off.